feel very honored that I was asked to come and speak on forgiveness. I'll give you a little bit of background about myself. Like Star said, my name is Monica Meade. I'm a clinical therapist. I have offices in Monument and Colorado Springs. I specialize in EMDR therapy, which is the treatment of grief, trauma. It also is indicated to treat such things as depression, anxiety, addiction, among other things. I specifically went into counseling and not public speaking, so bear with me. This is going to be fun for all of us, I'm sure. I've been in the mental health field for about 12 years, and during this time I have had the opportunity and the honor to work with men, women, children, families, and couples in different aspects of their life, going through different things that they have to navigate through. And I'm always honored that they trust me to walk the journey with them. I have walked alongside deep pain, and I have seen the beauty that healing brings. And so I know that it is possible in all things. And about 5 years ago, without my permission, I was taught the depths of grief and loss. And I truly believe that because of this, I am more willing as a therapist to sit and have those hard conversations and do that tough work that oftentimes can be very difficult to do. And I don't have a problem doing that now. And I always strive to do so without any judgment. That's never held in my office and with clients. So do we have, okay, we do have it up there. Oh, gonna need that for sure. Thank you. I would have forgotten. So I'm gonna try to stand to the side so I can see the PowerPoint as well. So tonight's agenda will be what is forgiveness and what it is not, because there's oftentimes a lot of confusing indicators about what forgiveness is. And then we'll talk about why we should forgive, why it's beneficial to us to forgive, and why it's beneficial to others. And we'll talk about the Bible and what the Bible says on forgiveness. And then I will give my own personal testimony. And this is exactly why, and precisely why, I asked Star to dim the lights in the audience, because I've only shared this on one other occasion, and it's very difficult for me. And oftentimes if I see a reaction from somebody else, it increases my emotional reaction. And I'm, as my daughter would say, an ugly crier, so it's for the benefit of everybody. We don't do that. And then at the very end, if there's any questions or comments, I'll go ahead and answer those at that time. So the biblical definition of forgiveness is the act of pardoning the offender. The Greek word translated of forgiveness literally means to let go. We see this theme in the Bible show up over and over. In the Lord's Prayer, in fact, it commands us to forgive others as we have been forgiven by the Lord, and we have acknowledged that we have been forgiven. The psychological definition of forgiveness is the mental and/or spiritual process of ceasing to feel resentment, indignation, or anger against another person for a perceived offense, difference, or mistake, or ceasing to demand punishment or restitution. Webster's dictionary also has its own version. It's to cease to feel resentment against an offender. And what all three of these definitions carry in common or have in common is the letting go part, the act of letting go, whether it's letting go of the hurt that was caused, letting go of the feeling that you need to retaliate, letting go of anger and hate that weighs us down. They all ask that we let go. And when you forgive, you heal. And when you heal, you grow. And remember that healing is layers. And what I mean by that is that you may think, okay, I did this and now I'm okay. But there's always more to it, and it goes deeper and it keeps going. And it's not done even when you think it is. And the only way that you know that your healing is done is when there's no longer a charge associated with the memory or associated with the pain of that. And so you just continue to heal and do the work until there's not a charge associated with it. I really like this quote by Nelson Mandela, and I just thought that, it just really spoke to me, and I feel like it speaks of love and of humanity, and we can all use more of that always. And so I just wanted to take a minute and just kind of think about this. When a deep injury is done to us, we never heal until we forgive. Kind of proof that we have to do that work, we have to do that hard work. And in my practice, I never ask my clients to go somewhere that I will not go or that I have not been. So if I'm asking them to do forgiveness work, I have had to do that myself. If I'm asking them to be vulnerable, I've also had to do that myself, not always with them, but I've had to do my own work to get there. And that's important in building empathy and compassion, because when I'm asking a client to do something, I have to understand how difficult that can be for them. And I have to understand how the change can occur and how healing can occur. So forgiveness is not any of these things. It is not forgetting. Forgetting is not always beneficial to the person who has been hurt. So we don't always ask clients, I want you to forgive and forget. That's never something that would come out of my mouth, because a lot of times the hurt that has been caused needs to be remembered so it doesn't continue to re-injure the person in the same way, or so the offender doesn't continue to re-injure the same person. So instead of thinking of it as forgiving and forgetting, I like to think of it as remembering, but without the anger attached to it. So remembering the lesson that came along with that. Condoning, you don't have to, when you forgive a person, it is not saying that you condone their behavior. It is not saying, I'm okay with what you did, it's all right, there's no big deal. That is not part of the deal with forgiveness. Doesn't mean you have to condone the behavior, doesn't mean that you're okay with it. It also doesn't mean that you have to trust the offender again. If you're in a relationship with them, you don't have to continue that relationship. That's not, again, part of the deal. Forgiving can mean I forgive you, but I'm also releasing myself from you in any attachment, in any form that means. Remembering that the people that hurt you are not going to be the people to put you back together. So sometimes it's safe to say, I have to walk away from this, and I have to be okay with that. And also remembering that with forgiveness, it is never weakness, because that is not an attribute of the weak. It takes courage and strength and faith to forgive, and those are all attributes of faithfulness and strength. Forgiveness is not a one-time deal. And what I mean with that is by saying that we forgive somebody, we don't just say it and forget it and move on. A lot of times when the hurt is very big, or that pain that they have caused is huge in our lives, it's not going to be a one-time injury and then we're over it. It's going to be an everyday conscious effort to heal that pain, to heal that hurt and that injury. And that isn't always easy. And there's a story in the Bible where Peter asks Jesus, how many times am I supposed to forgive? And he says 70 times 7. Essentially what Jesus is saying is keep on forgiving until you experience the freedom of forgiveness. And it may require a lifetime of forgiving, but it is important to the Lord, and we must continue forgiving until the matter has been settled in our own hearts. Forgiveness is not absolving the offender of the responsibility at all. It is simply saying that you are not going to let that anger and rage weigh you down, that you will let go of that. And we do that because our higher self exists in a state of love. And every time you are loving, every time you are kind, forgiving, and compassionate, both to yourself and to others, you are existing in your highest state. That's when you are closer to God, and that's when you are closer to everything holy. So forgiveness opens a pathway to a new place of peace. And this is where we persevere despite what has been done to us. If you are holding on to the hate of unforgiveness, you are blocking your own blessing. And what I mean by this is when our hands are full because we're holding on to pain and we're holding on to rage, we can't also receive the blessing that God has for us. So letting that go is also allowing that blessing into our life. And remembering that what is for us, that will always be for us. And it will be waiting when we are ready to let go. So the benefit of forgiving. This one. So physiologically, forgiveness lowers levels of anxiety and depression. It decreases anger. It increases your self-worth. It allows you to be grounded and present. And what studies have shown is that when we hold on to this feeling of unforgiveness and this feeling of anger and stress, it increases cortisol levels in our body. And the increase of cortisol levels also increases our susceptibility to autoimmune disease, to heart disease, and to cancer. So by not letting that go, we're not only doing psychological damage to ourselves, we're also doing this physiological damage that is lifelong to ourselves and into our life. The spiritual benefits that we also gain from it is a new relationship with God, a new relationship with our spirituality. And this can be that we are understanding that we are now worthy and have always been worthy of God's love and forgiveness when we're willing to forgive others and ourselves. So while working with clients over and over again, I see the same three themes showing up and why it's so difficult to forgive yourself and why that doesn't happen so easily. And these are the same three themes that I see. So the first one is shame. And what shame is it's saying, I am this. I am a liar. I am a cheater. I am guilty of what I have done. And shame is difficult because it requires us to admit our faults. It requires us to say something, to acknowledge it. And I know that this can be difficult when it's a big hurt or we've done something huge and we hold a lot of shame with that. And what we don't want in that moment is to look at another person and to see the disgust in their face for what we have done. And so a lot of times that's what's difficult in getting clients to come in and do the forgiveness work, or that's what's difficult in forgiving yourself because you're holding on to that, and you're holding on to that shame. And the second one is guilt. And so the difference between shame and guilt is guilt says, I did this, and shame says, I am this. So guilt says, I did cheat, I did lie, I did steal. And the thing about guilt and shame is that they often run hand in hand with one another. And shame needs secrecy to thrive, right? So if we're keeping it in and we're holding it, it's becoming bigger and bigger. And it's the part of letting it out and letting it go. So you're no longer carrying that alone. It's the thing with humans, we're built for socialization, we're built for relationship. And so when we can show up for another person in their shame, and we can be there and be present for them, it allows for the healing to take place. And that's not always with a friend or a family member. That's where professionals can come in and do that with you, because we're trained for that. We're trained to sit with you in those moments, and we're trained to do it without judgment. And I can promise you that every single client that walks into my office is met with love, with unbiased, with non-judgment, and just only healing. And that's what I want for every single one of them. And I can say the same for all of my colleagues. I have yet to meet a counselor or a therapist who is in it for themselves. It's never for that. We're always, want the best for them, want the most healing, and we pray for that as well. The last one is humiliation. This often blocks self-forgiveness because it's embarrassing to say out loud what we did or admit our own faults, because nobody wants to fall short of expectations. Nobody wants to feel like they're letting somebody down. And so when we have to admit that and it can be humiliating. And a lot of times these three things run in a cycle. One will lead to the other, and so on and so forth, until there is the intersection of the forgiveness work for ourselves and to have that done. So there's 4 R's to self-forgiveness that I use over and over. The first R is responsibility. So in order to forgive yourself, you have to take responsibility for what you have done. Whatever the action was that you did that you need to own up to. It's taking responsibility, admitting fault, even if it's just out loud, even if it's on paper, just admitting fault. Because taking responsibility is acknowledging that there was something done that was wrong. The second one is remorse. And the best proof of remorse is changed behavior. And so what we do with that is we say, I no longer want to be this way, so I'm going to change my behavior. That's leading me to behave in a manner that I don't want to do, or that's not pleasing to myself or my family. And remorse is, again, owning up to it and then changing that behavior and the apology in that. Restoration. So restoration is, again, part of the healing process and forgiveness. And restoration is also knowing that you are restored in God's love, that you are made new again, that what you have done has been forgiven. And that leads to the very last one of renewal, and knowing that you are loved by God and that you are forgiven by Him, and that you can then move forward. And if you choose to, you can help somebody else by sharing your story with them, by sharing your pain and allowing them to see God's love through you. So as I said, over and over, we see this theme show up in the Bible. And I'm just going to go over a few passages with you that speak on forgiveness. The first one is Ephesians 4:32. And I will read the New International Version first, and then the Message second. And if you're not familiar with the Message is just written in today's speak. So it's the Bible formatted in our language that we speak today. So it's a little easier to understand, and quite frankly, it's probably my favorite version because I can understand it and because I can relate it to my everyday experiences. So Ephesians 4:32, the New International Version. Be kind and compassionate to one another, forgiving each other just as Christ and God forgave you. And the Message says, be gentle with one another, sensitive. Forgive one another as quickly and thoroughly as God and Christ forgave you. And again, both of those are just reminders of empathy and compassion and how we are given forgiveness from God without question, without a doubt. He is willing to give that to us over and over again. And in turn, He's also asking us to give that to one another because we're human and we are fallen and we are going to make mistakes and we are going to continue to make mistakes. So just having that compassion and empathy for that. Colossians 3:13, the New International Version. Bear with each other and forgive another. If any of you has a grievance against someone, forgive as the Lord forgave you. And the Message Version. Be quick to forgive an offense. Forgive as quickly as completely as the Master forgave you, and regardless of what else you put on or love. I think that one's my favorite because I think forgiveness comes from a place of love for ourselves, love for God, love for humanity. And so just keeping that in mind and remembering that. Luke 17, verses 3 and 4, the New International Version. If your brother or sister sins against you, rebuke them. And if they repent, forgive them. The Message Version. Be alert. If you see your friend doing wrong, correct him. If he responds, forgive him. Even if it's personal against you and repeated 7 times through the day, and 7 times he says, I'm sorry, I won't do it again, forgive him. So, like I said, this theme shows up over and over in the Bible. In the New International Version of the Bible, forgiveness is mentioned 14 times, once in the Old Testament and 13 times in the New Testament. The word forgive is mentioned 42 times in the Old Testament and 33 in the New. and the word forgiven, 17 in the old, 28 in the new. So the concept that continues to show up over and over, we have reason to believe that this is exactly the path that God wants us to follow, that brings us closer to Him and allows us to exist in our higher self. But what you will notice in those three passages is that there is the word remorse or repent, or somebody else is asking for your forgiveness. So how do we find forgiveness when there is no remorse present? So if it's a big offense that is done to you, and it's a deep hurt, and that is so understandable. And believe me when I say this, that forgiveness is very difficult in those times. I understand that. They may not deserve your forgiveness, but you deserve peace, and that is why it should occur. Because there's an old adage that says that forgiveness to another person is like unshackling a prisoner and realizing you were the prisoner all along. So they may have caused the first wound, they may have thrown the first stone, but you're continuing to let that hurt occur by hanging on to it, by ruminating on it, by not letting it go. And the damage that you are doing to yourself in those moments and those things is worse than anything another person can do to you. So that's why we must let that go, because we're continuing to re-injure ourselves, regardless of if we give the other person forgiveness or not. They can continue on with their life. They can move on. And if we're staying stuck in that and ruminating on that, we're not allowing that. We're allowing anger and hurt and heaviness just to keep us in one place. And because of that, we're not making new neural pathways when we're focused on anger and we're focused on pain. And it literally kills our brain when we do that. And so letting go of that, not for them, but for us, is the first step in understanding how forgiveness can take place. What if there is no apology? What if they haven't apologized or you no longer have contact with them, or they've died, and you want to do that forgiveness work because you need to move forward and you need to let go, and you don't want to carry that heaviness with you anymore? Well, when there's no apology, there still can be forgiveness, because oftentimes an apology means that they're admitting to their wrongdoings, or it can be difficult for another person to do that. But the decision must be made to heal, and that healing begins with forgiveness. So it's time to make that decision, and at that point you decide, am I going to forgive myself? Is it time to forgive God? Is it time to forgive the other person? And where that's going to start. But it has to start in order for healing to begin. So again, forgiveness is not for the offender. And these are just a couple of my favorite quotes on forgiveness and how it brings the individual that is doing the work peace. The first one is by Mark Twain, and it says, "Forgiveness is the fragrance that the violet sheds on the heel that has crushed it." So when you just take a moment and think about that, and you think of the violet that has been crushed, it's no longer allowed to thrive, to bloom, to grow, and yet it still leaves the person that killed it with the fragrance, with this beautiful fragrance. So it's a gift to the person who's done that. Forgiveness has nothing to do with absolving a criminal of his crime, and it has everything to do with relieving oneself of the burden of being a victim, letting go of the pain, and transforming oneself from victim to survivor. And what I see with clients a lot of times is that if this is an injury or that they've been hanging on to for a long time, it can be difficult to let go of that, because you don't know what your identity is without it. If you've always identified as a victim of sexual abuse, if you've always identified as a victim of cheating or something like that, then it's hard to let go of that and become something else. But being a survivor and coming out on the other side is where beauty is and where God is, and that's where we want to live. When you forgive, you love, and when you love, God's light shines upon you. I think this one is the one that speaks the most to my heart, because I had to do that work in order to be closer to God, and in order to feel His light shining through me and touch others. And so that is probably my favorite one of the three. So we can all agree that forgiveness is a beautiful idea until we're the ones that have to do it. That's when it becomes difficult. So like I said, I never ask my clients to go somewhere that I have not gone. And I never ask them to do forgiveness work without them knowing that I've had to walk that journey. I don't share with them what my journey has been or what my forgiveness has been. I shared it with just a couple of clients, and only if I thought that it would help them in their journey. And so I'm gonna give my testimony now. We can switch to the next slide. This is my daughter. Her name is Kiana. She was 14 and a half when she took this picture. And if you look at it, it just shows her personality perfectly. She's fun and loving and caring. And everything I could ever have wished for in a child, and I'm so grateful that she is mine. Can we go to the next slide, please? This is her as a big sister. She has 2 younger siblings. Kyla is 5 years younger than her, and our youngest Ava is 13 years younger than her. Kiana took on the role as a big sister quite easily. She was never upset or angered by it. She just became the best big sister that anyone could ask for. I'm gonna read my testimony instead of just kind of winging it, because I feel like, as emotional as it is for me, if I read it, it will be more like facts and not so much emotion put into it. Just so you know, it doesn't mean I'm not gonna cry, so remember that ugly crying thing. I can speak on forgiveness for several hours, and yet I only have a short amount of time, so I will try to squeeze in what I can. I'm going to start with how God has always had a plan for me. And He laid everything into my path to help me along my journey before I even knew what was happening. On December 23rd, 2013, my oldest daughter, Kiana, died. Her death certificate lists the cause of her death as homicide. On December 24th, 2013, I made the conscious decision to forgive the offender, the person who took her life from me. In 1999, I became a mother. My daughter, Kiana, gave my life a sense of purpose. I had married her father, and we moved 3,000 miles away from my family to Hawaii. And since I was 20 at the time that she was born, I was learning just as much as she was, so we grew up together. I got lucky with Kiana. She was an easy baby, the kind of child that makes you feel like you're excelling as a parent. So I just felt like everything that she was great at was because I was a great mom. And because her father was in the military, we moved a couple more times. First to Kansas, and then to Georgia, where my second daughter, Kyla, was born. Kyla and Kiana are 5 years apart. And Kiana was just so excited to have her little sister and to be a big sister. And Kyla quickly humbled me in my parenting skills. She taught me that maybe I wasn't such a great mom because she cried all the time, and that was a new adventure for me. Quite different from her sister. And, you know, she was just very strong-willed and has continued to be strong-willed, and to be quite frank with you, my rock to this day. In 2005, the girl's father and I got divorced. and I moved across country from Georgia to Colorado by myself. I packed up my car and loaded up my girls, and without a warning, showed up at my parents' doorstep. I was too ashamed to let them know the situation that I was in, and I knew that they wouldn't be happy with my decision to get a divorce. And so when I showed up, they welcomed us with open arms. And in order for you to understand why I was so ashamed of my divorce, I was the first person in my family to ever get a divorce. And when I say my family, I mean my grandparents, my parents, my cousins, my aunts and uncles. I was the first one. So I was very aware of the shame that I was bringing home that I had put on myself. My grandparents had been married for 65 years and my parents for 42 years. So me and not being able to make it work, I have carried that with me for a long time, and I probably always will. But I had 2 little girls, and so I had to do something with my life. I had no degree, no career. I had been a stay-at-home mom, and so I went back to school, got a degree in psychology, and got married within about a 4-year span of time. We moved out to Tennessee, the girls and I, and at that time, they were 9 and 5. And this is when I believe that God had already started putting down a foundation for me to survive my journey. The girls made friends rather easily in Tennessee. They excelled in everything that they did. It was really a great life for all of us. We really enjoyed it, and we missed our family terribly. We had lived with my parents for 4 years, and they had helped me not only raise the girls, but also were just a really strong source of support for myself. And so when my husband was given the opportunity to move and advance in his military career by going back to school, we took that opportunity and moved down here to Colorado Springs in 2011. And he attended Colorado Christian University to finish out his degree. And because God knows what we need and not what we want, I found out I was pregnant during that move. And this was a big surprise to us because I was on birth control and we were not planning on having any other children. But again, God is laying out my plans for me. So we moved, I was pregnant, we got settled in here. In 2012, our youngest daughter, Ava, was born. And that same year, Kiana was 13 and Kyla was 8. Both girls just really adored their little sister. Kiana took on the role of a second mother, even though I didn't want her to do that. It was just in her nature. So oftentimes she would come get the baby so I could take a shower or I could get a workout in. And she was just like that with both of her sisters. She just cared for them and kind of hovered over them as like a little mother to them. In 2013, I joined a CrossFit gym, and after a couple of months, I convinced Kiana to come along with me. And I loved our time together. This was just something her and I did. No one else did this with us, so we would have our alone time. I'd pick her up from school, and we'd go to the gym together, and we would talk, and we would laugh. We were always very close, and I feel honored that she always let me into her world. She continued to do that. As a teenager, I just felt really blessed that she let me be a part of her world and that we were very close. We would work out together and suffer together, and on our way home, we would always start with listening to music and singing along, and it would end with her kind of sharing her day with me, just kind of having really deep conversations. I'm always grateful that we had those moments together. And I really feel blessed that my last year with her was spent being a part of her, being a part of her life, and her letting me in that. we just got along really easily, her and I. I take no credit for that. That's just the kind of child that she was. She was just an amazing kid. I never deserved her. I always loved her, but I never deserved her, and I know that. She was always the first to apologize. She was always the bigger person. She continued to see the good in everybody, regardless of what they had done or regardless of what had been done to her. She always saw the good. Sometimes I wonder if maybe this world even deserved her. Because she was so responsible, she would babysit for our neighbors a lot and would babysit for her younger sisters for spending money. And we trusted her with that. She wasn't concerned with her phone or with other things. She would just pay attention to her sisters. And so on December 22nd, the night before her death, she was going to watch her sisters so her stepfather and I could go out to dinner. And we went out to dinner and we came home that night and the TV was on. She was watching Long Island Medium, but nobody was in the living room. And I looked at the baby monitor and I saw Kiana and her youngest sister Ava, who was 20 months at the time, laying on our bed, cuddled up together. And I mentioned to my husband to come over and look at the monitor because I said, look at this. The girls have the best big sister. I hope they always know that. He agreed with me. I went upstairs and I kissed my daughter. She woke up and I thanked her for watching the girls, and she said, I'm gonna go get in the shower now. And she went off to the shower. I got our youngest daughter, Ava, and I put her in her bed. And I went and checked on my daughter, Kyla, who was already asleep. And I went downstairs to do a little bit of work and wait for Kiana to get out of the shower and go to bed. I always wait for my girls to go to bed before I go to bed. My last memory of Kiana, my last moments with her, or after she got out of the shower, I was sitting working on my computer and she came downstairs to hug me and say goodnight. Sarah, I love you. So that's our family rule, is that we have to say I love you before we leave the other person. And she came down and she hugged me and her wet hair touched my face. And she said, I love you. And I'll never forget the smell of her shampoo and her lotion on her skin. I reminded her that she had passport pictures in the morning, and so she needed to get a good night's rest. And so she kind of joked with me for a little bit on how she was going to smile for her passport pictures. If you remember the picture previous to this, it was one of the goofy smiles. And I told her, you can only do one of those, the other ones have to be normal. And so she agreed to that, and we kind of laughed about it. She went on up to bed. I finished up my work, and I went and tucked in my girls. I went into Kyla's room. She was 9, and it wasn't uncommon for Kyla to be asleep in Kiana's room. They slept together. I'd say 99 times out of 100, they were in the same bed. Kyla would often come into our bed. And she wasn't that night, which I thought was odd, but I didn't think anything else of it. And I tucked in Kyla, I kissed her, and I shut her door. Went into Kiana's room. She was already asleep. Kissed her on the forehead. Shut her door. I went in and checked on my youngest daughter, Ava. She was sleeping, and I went to bed. Sometime in the middle of the night, I was woken up. Ava was crying, and again, this isn't uncommon. She'd come to my bed probably every night of the week, and so I just went in there and got her. Oftentimes I would put her in my bed and then go check on her sisters. I didn't on this night. I think I was too tired. I'll always regret that. I didn't make sure my girls were okay. I just went back to bed. I was woken up again about 5:30 a.m. Our dog was barking. This is uncommon for our dog. He doesn't bark and growl unless somebody's at our door or something is happening that he's unaware of, and I could hear him barking and running back and forth and growling. It just was out of character for our dog, and I had been startled awake by the bark, so I didn't really know what was happening. At the same time he was barking, I heard my husband say, "Something is wrong, something's wrong, something's not right." And in a matter of seconds, my entire world fell apart. My husband was concerned somebody was breaking into our home. I called 911 and was on the phone with him, with 911, with the dispatcher, letting her know that someone was breaking into our home, when my husband fired the first shots at the intruder. At that time, our middle daughter came into our room, concerned with what was going on. Our alarm was going off. The dog was barking. I expected her to be awake. I was waiting for Kiana to come in there, and she didn't. The details I'm not going to share are too painful for me to say out loud. But what I will say is that the person entering our home was not a burglar. It was my 14-year-old daughter. She had snuck out of our home, which was out of character, and was sneaking back in. And because my husband thought it was an intruder, he had shot her. The first responders were on the scene within seconds. The ambulance, policemen, EMTs, firefighters, they were all there. I must say that the first responders, ambulance, EMT, firefighters, policemen, I will forever be grateful for the way that they treated us, their kindness, their humanity, their professionalism in a moment when they didn't know what scene they were entering, if we were at fault, if it was an accident. They just continued to treat us with kindness and respect. I will forever be grateful for that. And I feel like it just has to be said because it goes unsaid often. My daughter was still breathing when they took her out of our home and put her in the ambulance, and I begged them to let me go. They wouldn't let me ride in the ambulance with her. I'm not sure why to this day, but a policeman offered to drive me. And so I had called my parents. They live 3 hours away in Alamosa. And I couldn't tell them anything. All I could get out was that Kiana had been shot. It was an accident. Daniel had done it. I needed them to get there. They didn't know anything else. And that I was gonna go to the hospital with policemen. I was only wearing a t-shirt at the time, a long sleeve shirt. And so I asked the policeman if I could go upstairs and where my girls were and let them know that I was gonna ride to the hospital. he agreed to do that I could do that. So I went upstairs and I put on some yoga pants, and I was still just wearing my pajama shirt. And he let me ride with him to the hospital. And he was asking me some questions, and I asked him at some point, is it okay if I don't answer any more questions and if I just pray? And he said that was fine. It's okay, of course. His name was Officer Spate. He was amazing. So I continued to pray. I carry a St. Jude prayer in my wallet with me. I've always carried it. And I pulled that out and I started praying to St. Jude. He's the patron saint of hopeless cases, and I just felt like if anybody could help me at this time, it was St. Jude. And so we got to the hospital. I was the only one there, and I kept asking for an update. I kept asking for, is everything okay? What's going on? How's everything doing? I'm not sure how much time had passed. And they took me into another room. The victim's advocate and a detective stayed with me the entire time. They told me that the doctor was going to come in and give me an update, and so I was really excited about that. When he walked into the room, he wouldn't look at me. He kept his head down. And I asked him how my daughter was. He didn't say anything for what seemed like forever. And then he finally said to me, she died. And I lost it. I cried the deepest cry. It comes from a place of physical pain that I believe can only be admitted from a mother in the loss of a child. And I've only heard it one other time since then. I yelled at him, I think. I don't really remember, but from what I do remember, I think I said to him to please go try harder, that was my baby, that I needed him to try again. He still wouldn't look at me. And so I kneeled before him and I got really calm. And I said, please, I need you to understand that that's my baby and that I need her. And I need you to go try one more time. There was nothing more he can do. And I just sat on the floor and cried. From this point on, I remember very little about what happened next. It's kind of as though I stepped outside of my body and just went through motions. I know that I was allowed to go see my daughter. They told me I could go see her. The detective also let me know that I wasn't allowed to touch her. It was still a crime investigation, and they weren't sure exactly what had happened. And they didn't want to taint any evidence. So when I walked into the room to see her, she was completely covered. The only thing showing was her face. She was covered with a white cloth, and she was perfect and beautiful and peaceful. And I walked in and I immediately kissed her, even though I wasn't supposed to. And out of the corner of my eye, I saw Detective Adelbush turn around. I'm not sure if she was a mother or she just saw that I needed that moment and chose to ignore it. Because I knew I wasn't allowed to do that, but she let me.
I'll forever be grateful for that moment that she let me have. And kissed her, and I cried and put my head on her, and she was still warm. She's had the most beautiful skin color. I kept looking at her, thinking, this is a nightmare. I'm gonna wake up. She's just sleeping. I had a priest come in and gave her her last rites and anointed her. I'm not sure how long I stayed in there with her. Everything is very a blur and very foggy to me. My parents arrived, and when they walked into the room, I remember going to my mom and sitting on her lap, and they were both crying. My mom and dad were both crying, and they prayed over me. They prayed for me. I didn't want to hear their prayers. I didn't want them to pray for me because I was so angry with God, and I was angry at myself. I didn't deserve prayers. I remember saying to my parents that I hated him. I hated my husband for doing this to me, for taking something so precious away from me. How could he do that? He knew that my girls were my world, that everything that I had ever done was for them, to be a good mom to them. And I was so angry with him. And they just continued to pray for me. At some point, my husband arrived to the hospital. I remember him coming into the room. I don't, again, really remember much. I remember that when he walked in that he was barefoot. And I just kept staring at his feet. I didn't want to look at him. I didn't want him to see me. I just wanted him out of there. I wanted nothing to do with him. I hated him. It came from a deep part of who I was. It consumed me, the hate, the rage, the anger. And yet I couldn't say anything. I didn't want to say anything. And my parents prayed for him too. And then we had to leave the hospital. I couldn't fathom my daughter spending a night away from me. And now she was going to spend the rest of my life away from me. And I was overcome with sadness. I had signed the donor registry to donate all her organs, any tissue, anything that could be used. I wanted to be used because I wanted a part of her to live on. And as we were walking out of the hospital, I got a call from the donor registry that they weren't going to be able to use anything, that none of her organs would be viable. She had lost too much blood and had a blood transfusion, and because of that, nothing could be used. And so in the middle of the hospital, I lost it. I fell onto the floor crying because now it was final. There was no part of her that was going to continue to live. And I didn't want to face that reality. My neighbors had come and got my girls from my house and were keeping them, and so we had to go to them. And I guess at some point we decided who was going to tell the girls what had happened. We agreed that it would be my dad. He's also a counselor, and so I guess we figured that he would be the best one to let the girls know I couldn't do it. I was too emotional. And as soon as we walked in, Kyla, my 9-year-old, looked at me and said, "Mom, how's my sister?" Kiana had been Kyla's anchor for her entire life. When the girls would go stay with their dad in the summer, Kiana was the one that took care of Kyla. Kiana was the one that showed up for Kyla, was able to calm her, was able to do things for her. And so I knew that if anyone was going to be as affected as I was by Kiana's death, it would be Kyla. So I was very concerned about her reaction to what was going to her sister's death. I expected her to be upset. I expected her to be angry. And when she said, "Mom, how's my sister?" my dad said, "Kyla didn't make it. She died." And Kyla immediately looked at her stepdad, who has been in her life since she was 1 year old. And she said, "It's okay, Daddy. It's okay. We forgive you. Kiana knows you were just protecting us. It's okay." I felt like a terrible person because this 9-year-old could see and could forgive, and I was so filled with rage and hatred that I couldn't. She got it instantly. She knew. She carried forgiveness with her instantly. Kiana's dad was in Wisconsin for the holidays with his wife, and they were on their way down. So I was very worried as to what his reaction was going to be. And I figured that when he showed up, he was going to yell at me and tell me I'm a bad mom, probably cuss at me, not because he's a bad person, not at all, but because that's what I deserved. So when he got there, Kyla and I met him outside, and he came up to the door and hugged both of us. And he said to me, "When I got here, I wanted to be mad at you, and I wanted to be angry with you. And I see you, and you're so broken. I can't do anything but cry with you." We were still at our friend's house. We weren't allowed back to our house because it was still considered a crime scene. And there was a lot of media surrounding our home, so we couldn't get back there anyway. And so Kyla's and Kiana's father and I went up to my neighbor's guest bedroom, and we talked. And we agreed that, we were both very hurt and angry, and we were both holding on to the unforgiveness. And he said to me, "I hate God." These words that I had been feeling and was too ashamed to say out loud. My reaction to him was, we can't hate God. That's where Kiana is, and we have to trust that he's going to take care of her. I was probably saying that more for myself than for him, because I was angry with God for what I believed he had taken my daughter from me. So we were finally allowed to go back into our home, and it was really late at night. I'm not sure what time. I just know that it was really dark outside, and Kyla and Kiana's father and I were going to stay in Kiana's room that night. And so the three of us laid in her bed. I was crying. I couldn't control my crying. Kyla and her dad had both fallen asleep, and I just laid there crying, and I was begging God to take this pain from me because it was too big. hesitate sharing this next part because it's very personal to me, and I don't want anyone to disbelieve it. But as I was begging God to take this pain from me and to bring my daughter back, I saw her standing in her closet with her head in her hands like this and her hair over her face. And I saw that she was sad. And at the same time that I saw her, I heard, as clear as I am speaking to you, a voice in my ear that said to me, "You have to forgive and everyone will follow." It was not a suggestion, it was truth. And I believed it, and I believe that it was the Holy Spirit. And I believe this because there is nothing that could have changed my heart in an instant, aside from God, aside from the Holy Spirit coming into me and coming to me, and my daughter's love. And so I woke up Kiana's dad, and I told him what I believed to be true and what I had heard. And I expected him to be angry that I would even suggest such a thing, because I knew his pain was as deep as mine. And he looked at me and said, "Okay, then that's what we do." And again, I feel like that is proof that God was there with us, and that the voice that I heard was coming from something bigger than I will ever know. But the bigger part of it is that when I chose to release myself from that pain and chose to forgive, when God allowed me to let that go, He eased the burden and the weight and the heaviness of hatred and anger. And in forgiving, I didn't forget what happened to my daughter. That wasn't part of the forgiveness still. I miss her every moment of every day. There's not a moment that I don't long for her. I don't condone the behavior that led to her death. It is just me letting go of the hate and freeing myself to live in a place of love and in my highest self. And because this pain for me was so huge, forgiveness has not been a one-time deal. For 5 years, every single moment and every single day, I wake up and I remind myself that I made the decision to forgive. That I made the decision to let go of that pain, to let go of that anger, and to try to live in love. And it's not always easy, and I slip up and I forget, and I want to be angry, and I want to be filled with hate. And that's when I ask God to join me and to be with me and to help me, because I can't do it alone. He's never failed me. He has continued to show up for me and to allow me to forgive. I think that I could have carried that hatred with me the rest of my life, and it may have been the easier path, but it would have been heavier for me to carry. And I also believe that had I not forgiven, nobody would have thought any differently of me. I, in fact, have been asked several times, why? Why did you forgive? How could you forgive? And in a sense, people wonder how you can let something that big go. And I always explain to them that it wasn't for me. I didn't do it for me. I did it because I owe my daughter more than that. Her life was never taken in vain, that it was more beautiful and more precious to me than to hold on to hate. And she was also the most forgiving person And so that was kind of like the gift that she left me. And I really believe that she wants me to heal, and in order to do that, I do have to forgive. And so when I'm filled with that rage and that anger, I know that she's not close to me because I don't feel her close to me. So I have to let go of that and exist in a place of love in order for my relationship with her to continue. I also had to forgive myself. I had to forgive myself for not protecting her. I'm her mom, and I didn't protect her. Should have known that she wasn't in bed, and I didn't. I've held myself accountable for that for 5 years. I had to forgive myself for bringing the man who was responsible for her death into our lives. And for not checking on her, not making sure she was okay that night. So the forgiveness for myself has been a more difficult journey than the forgiveness of my husband. I had to also forgive God. And this didn't happen right away. I wish I could say that I was a good Christian and it just happened immediately, but it didn't for me. It took about 6 months. And I remember the day that it happened, that I released that anger that I was hanging on to. I was driving alone in my car, and I just gotten off the phone with my mom, who was a teacher, and was telling me about parent-teacher conference and how some of the parents didn't show up. When I hung up the phone with her, I was so angry because there was parents who didn't even want to be a part of their child's life, and all I've ever wanted to do my entire life was be a mom. My daughter was taken from me. And so when I got off the phone with my mom, I started yelling at God, and I told him it wasn't fair. And I said, how could you do this to me? All I ever wanted to do was be a mother. I was always a good mom to her. I showed up for her. I didn't deserve this. And because God is good and because God is faithful and graceful to us, He allowed me to understand that He cried first. So when I lost my daughter, He cried with me. He wasn't taking her from me. He met me where I was, and I was never alone in that. I was never alone in my pain. He continued to show up for me. He put everything in my path to make sure I was going to survive, moving me here to Colorado to be close to my mom and dad, who I needed more times than I can even tell you over the past 5 years, who have showed up for me at the drop of a hat. Any moment I can call them and they will be there. So Him bringing us here was part of His plan. My girls, Kyla first, for being the first one to even show me the option of forgiveness in that, and for being my rock, and for allowing me to be who I was, and yet showing me that there is still good and kindness in this world. She brought me laughter on days that I didn't feel like laughing. And Ava was only 20 months old at the time, so she needed me for her daily needs. I had to meet those daily needs for her. And had it not been for Ava, I would have stayed in bed all day. I would have taken Kyla to school and just come back home and laid in bed and cried and probably given up on life, which is what I wanted to do for a long time. And yet my girls deserved the same mother that their sister had. And so I needed them more than they needed me at that time. And I'm forever grateful for them for showing up. Also, my CrossFit gym that loved my daughter and loved having her there. And every year on her birthday, they've continued to do a workout in her honor, and they wear her t-shirts with her face on them. And they show up for me. That's also been my support network here in Colorado Springs. All of my best friends have come from there, and they are truly God-sent because every single one of them was put into my life for my survival, and I really do believe that. So as I conclude today, I want to thank you for allowing me to be vulnerable and to share in this space. I also want to let you know that these past 5 years have not been easy journey or an easy path for me. And like I said, my forgiveness has been an everyday conscious effort, but also my relationship with God has allowed me to grow and to share my testimony, which I didn't think would ever be possible because it's so emotional for me. But I do know that there is healing and that there is grace when you walk with God and when you allow Him to carry you through your tough times. And I'm not just saying that because it's the right thing to say. I'm saying that because it's my truth. So if there's any questions or comments, I can take those now. If not, I can just have a moment of silence or prayer, whatever I want to do. But that concludes my entire presentation for tonight.